Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Election Trackers. And today we're going to be taking a look at the 2026 United States Senate elections. But before I start, I'd like to say if you like my content, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you know when we upload, and also leave a like and comment. And with that said, let's get into it. So we can start by filling in the solid states for each party. So those are going to be Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia for the Republicans. And for the Democrats, it's going to be Oregon, Colorado, New Mexico, Minnesota, Illinois, Virginia, Delaware, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. Now we can take a more detailed look at the likely states for each party. These are going to be the states that are voting for either party by between 5 and 10 percentage points, starting with the state of Nebraska. Now, Nebraska is a state that typically votes for Republicans by wide margins. In 2024, Donald Trump won the state by over 20 points. And in the Senate election in 2024, Pete Ricketts won by 25 points himself. But if we look at the polling average in this state, Pete Ricketts is actually only leading by 3 points. And that's because he's not actually facing a Democrat. He's facing an independent, Dan Osborne. And Dan Osborne is a decent candidate. He ran in the Senate election in 2024 in the regular election against Deb Fischer. And he only lost by 6.7 points. And that was on the same ballot that Trump won by over 20 points. So I do think that this election is going to be competitive, but I do still think that Ricketts is going to win by a decent margin, so I am calling it likely Republican. Now, the next state we're going to look at is going to be the state of South Carolina. And this race was shaken up recently because Lindsey Graham was running for re-election, and then on July 11th, he died and was replaced by his sister, Darlene Graham, who is now holding the seat and running for a full term. And even though South Carolina is a solidly Republican state, Trump won it by 17 points in 2024. And in 2020, Lindsey Graham won by over 10 points. But Darlene Graham is going to be facing a tough primary because even though she is the incumbent, she has only been in office for a couple weeks, so she doesn't have the same advantages that a normal incumbent would have, other than the fact that Trump has endorsed her for the full term. I do still think she's going to win pretty easily, but I think it's going to be closer election than people are expecting, so I am going to call it likely Republican. And those are the only two likely Republican states. Now for the lone likely Democrat state, it's going to be the state of New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire is a state that can get pretty close. In the last election, Kamala Harris only won it by 2.8%, but even though it is close, it still did vote against Trump all 3 times that he was on the ballot. And if we go and look at the polling average right now, Chris Pappas is leading John Sununu by over 7 points. And even though Sununu is a good candidate, in fact, he used to be the senator here, he is trailing by a lot. And because of the national environment, it's a Republican president midterm, which means the Democrats are going to have an advantage. Right now, they're leading the generic ballot by 5.8 points. And so I do think that Chris Pappas is going to win this race fairly easily, so I am calling it likely Democrat. Now with the likely states covered, we can get into the toss-up states, starting with the state of Alaska. Alaska being a toss-up is unusual because it's typically a very strong Republican state. Donald Trump won it 3 times by very wide margins. In 2024, he won it by 13.1 points. And in the Senate election in 2020, the incumbent Dan Sullivan won by 12.7 points, and he is running for re-election. And the competitive nature of this race is not because of Sullivan or because he's unpopular or anything, but because his opponent is former Congresswoman Mary Peltola, who surprisingly won in 2022 against Sarah Palin in the special election in the congressional district, and then served a term from 2023 to 2025 before losing re-election in 2024. And even though she did lose re-election in 2024, that was when Donald Trump won the state by 13 plus points. And so she was affected by the down ballot lag. But if we look at the polling average in Alaska right now, she actually is leading Dan Sullivan by 1.4 points. And even though Peltola is leading the polling average slightly right now, it is still a way out. And Alaska is a very deeply Republican state. And Dan Sullivan is not an offensive incumbent. So I do still think that this is an uphill battle for Mary Peltola. I think that Dan Sullivan is going to win. I just think it's going to be a lot closer than usual. I'm going to call this state lean Republican. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at the state of Texas. And this is another very interesting race because the incumbent Senator John Cornyn lost his primary to Ken Paxton earlier this year, and Cornyn was expected to win by a relatively wide margin, but now that Paxton has entered the race, it has made this race a lot closer. If we take a look at the polling average, Tallarico is actually leading by 0.4 over Paxton, and this is pretty surprising because in the 2024 presidential election, Donald Trump won the state by almost 14 points, which was his strongest performance out of all 3 elections that he ran in. And so I think it's pretty notable that this race is even close at all. The last time Texas was remotely close was in 2018 when Ted Cruz barely beat Beto O'Rourke by 2.6 points. And these races have a lot of similarities. It's in a Trump midterm. The Republican candidate is weak and the Democratic candidate is relatively strong. The main difference to me is that since 2018, Texas has gotten a lot better. In 2016 and 2018, it seemed like Texas was shifting more and more towards Democrats and they were getting a lot closer to winning it. And then by 2024, it completely reverted to where it was in the early 2010s. And even though Paxton is a controversial candidate, I do still think that he is going to win this election. I think it's going to be close again, but I am going to call it lean Republican. Even though Tallarico is leading the polls right now, it's very close. And I think as the election grows closer, Republicans who are dissatisfied with the fact that Paxton is the candidate are going to still end up preferring him to a Democrat. And so I do think that Texas is going to go Republican again. Next up, we're going to take a look at the state of Iowa. And this is another state that voted for Trump by very wide margins 3 times. In 2024, Trump won the state by over 13 points. And even though in recent years Iowa has trended further and further towards Republicans, it is still a very elastic state and can get very close, especially in midterm election years. And this is another race where right now in the polling average, the Democrat is actually leading. But again, it's by a very small margin, and Iowa is a very Republican state. And ultimately, Ashley Hinson and Josh Turek are both strong candidates. And if you have 2 strong candidates in a state that is leaning towards Republicans, I think the Republican is going to win that battle. So I'm going to call it lean Republican. Next up, we're going to take a look at the state of Michigan. This race is notable because it's one of only 2 states in this cycle that has a Democratic incumbent in a state that Trump won in 2024, the other being Georgia. And that incumbent, Gary Peters, is actually retiring. And the primary hasn't happened yet, but it seems like the Democratic nominee is going to be Abdul El-Sayed, who is going to be facing off against Republican Mike Rogers, who narrowly lost the Senate election in 2024 against Alyssa Slotkin. And even though Donald Trump did win the state of Michigan twice out of his 3 elections, Michigan is still a pretty blue state. In fact, the state hasn't voted for a Republican for Senate since the 1990s. So naturally, Democrats do have a slight advantage here. Although polling is showing this race to be a lot closer than I think a lot of people expected. And I think that's because Abdul El-Sayed is a weaker candidate. His primary opponent, Haley Stevens, is polling a lot better than he is, but he is going to end up winning this primary, which is going to make this race more competitive than Democrats would like it to be. And even though his opponent, Mike Rogers, did lose this Senate election in 2024, he only lost by 0.3 points, which was the closest race in the country other than Pennsylvania. And so right now, there are a lot of arguments for either Republicans or Democrats winning this race. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump is very unpopular. He's minus 18 in his approval right now, and Democrats are leading the generic ballot by almost 6 points. So even though this is going to be a close race, I do think El-Sayed is going to win. I think it's going to be very narrow, but I am going to call it tilt Democrat. Next state we're going to be looking at is the state of Ohio. And this is another competitive race in a state that Donald Trump won by strong margins every time. In 2016, he won by 8.1. In 2020, he won by 8 flat. And in 2024, he won by 11.2. Before Trump, Ohio was one of the most important swing states in the country, but since Trump ran in 2016, Ohio has been a strong Republican state. The reason that this race is close is because former Senator Sherrod Brown is running for a seat against incumbent John Husted. And the last Senate election in this seat was actually when J.D. Vance was elected in 2022. And this is a special election to fill the rest of the term since he had to resign to become vice president. And in 2024, Sherrod Brown actually lost the Senate election. He was the incumbent here for 18 years, but he lost to Bernie Moreno by 3.6 points. But he still overperformed Kamala Harris by over 8 points here. And the last time he ran for re-election in a Trump midterm, he won by 6.8 points. So in a blue wave year, it is possible that Brown wins this seat. And even though his performance in 2024 was relatively strong, he did still lose as an incumbent, and Ohio is only getting redder as a state. I think this mostly has to do with name recognition right now, because right now in the polls, Sherrod Brown does have a small lead over John Husted. I think as the campaign progresses, Republicans will gain the advantage in this race. So I do think that Husted is going to win election to a full term, so I'm going to call it lean Republican. Next, we're going to be talking about the state of Georgia, and this is the other state that has a Democratic incumbent that Trump won in 2024, except the difference is that the incumbent Jon Ossoff is running for re-election. And Ossoff is a very good candidate. He has very good optics, and he's kind of running away with the race right now. In the polling average, he's up by 8.6 points. And even though Trump did win in 2024, it was only by 2.2 points. It was actually his closest swing state victory outside of the Rust Belt. And Georgia has been trending slowly towards Democrats. In 2020, Joe Biden surprisingly won it by zero point 0.2 points after Trump had won it by 5.1 in 2016. So that was a pretty big swing from 2016 to 2020. And Trump's 5-point victory in 2016 was already seen as a close victory at the time. 2016 was also the last time that Republicans won a Senate race in the state of Georgia. Since then, 2020, Democrats flipped both seats. And in 2022, Raphael Warnock won re-election to a full term. And so overall, I do think that Georgia's looking pretty good for Democrats. I don't think that Ossoff's going to win by more than 5 points. I think this one's going to get closer as the campaign goes on. But I do think he's going to do pretty well here. I think he's going to win, so I'm calling it lean Democrat. Next up is going to be the state of North Carolina. And North Carolina is interesting because on the federal level, it's always close. Republicans have seemed to win here constantly. However, on the statewide level, Democrats seem to have an advantage here. Democrats have won the last 3 gubernatorial elections, including in 2016 and 2020 when Roy Cooper ran. And in 2016, Cooper unseated an incumbent Republican governor, and then in 2020, he won re-election by a pretty wide margin, even when Donald Trump carried the state. And now he is the Democratic nominee for the Senate race, and he's going to be facing off against Republican Michael Whatley. Whatley does not have as much name recognition as Cooper does here, and Cooper was a very popular governor when he was here. And right now, he similarly is running away with this race, just like Ossoff was. He's winning by 8.2 points. Although I do think it's going to be closer than that, I do think that this is finally going to be the year that Democrats win a federal race in the state of North Carolina, so I'm going to call it lean Democrat. Finally, our final swing state is going to be the state of Maine. And Maine is the only state this cycle that Kamala Harris won that has a Republican incumbent, Susan Collins. And Susan Collins is a notorious overperformer. In the presidential election in 2020, Joe Biden won Maine by 9.1 points. But in the Senate election, Susan Collins won by 8.6 points. So she performed Donald Trump by almost 18 points in this election. And right now, if we look at the polling average, Troy Jackson is beating Collins, but only by 1.1 points. And in 2020, Susan Collins didn't lead a single poll, and she still won the race by a wide margin. So the polls in Maine especially don't really mean much, especially this far out. And it's true that this year is probably going to be a very good year for Democrats. They're leading the generic ballot by 5.8 points, but Joe Biden won the popular vote by 4.5 in 2020, and Collins was still able to win by over 8 points. So I do think she's going to be difficult to take down. I think it's going to be close this time. I think polarization is going to catch up to this race a little bit, but I do still think that Collins is going to hang on, so I am going to call this race tilt Republican. So now with the whole map filled in, we have Republicans holding the Senate 52 to 48. Democrats flip North Carolina, and every other seat holds for their respective parties. And even though this year is expected to be very good for Democrats, their geography in the Senate map is kind of horrible. They really only have a handful of pickup opportunities. And outside of North Carolina and Maine, to flip the Senate, they would need to win 2 seats that are in states that voted for Trump by over 10 points. So that is a high ask for them. Ultimately, I do think it's going to be very unlikely for Democrats to retake the Senate, but we're still 3 months out, so there is a lot that can happen in that amount of time. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you like my content, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you know when we upload. And also leave a like and comment. Let me know what you agree with and what you disagree with. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a great day.